You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
Now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. Got a special guest tonight, Andrew Giuliani. That's his official name. He's all right. Does anybody call you Andrew Harold? We'll find out in just a moment.
Only my mother when she gets mad at me. Andrew Harold, what are you
Andrew
doing?
Harold, eat your spaghetti.
Exactly.
Anyway, but he was a special assistant to President Donald Trump. He's associate director of the Office of Public Liaison during that period of time. He's currently, you can watch him on Newsmax television, and he also serves on the board of trustees of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Andrew, I'm not going to call you Andrew Harold. Andrew, welcome to the program.
Seth, thank you very much for having me. Just thinking about the history between the Giulianis, one older Giuliani than me and you. This is really an honor to be on with you.
No, it's really great. And you're running for governor of New York. So how's that going?
It's going great. I'll tell you, we announced our candidacy in May of this year. I guess this year's wrapping up now, but May 18th of 2021. And there have been 4 public polls that have come out. The most recent one came out 2 weeks ago. A Siena poll had us up 17 points for the nomination. All 4 of the polls that have come out have had us up at least 15 points for the Republican nomination. Zev, that on top of looking at the numbers from November 2nd of this year in the election, we really see a path to victory, not just in winning the Republican nomination, but in winning back the executive chambers and taking the governor's mansion back.
So let's look at that, because you have really the 2 races here. The first and foremost is the Republican primary. You have 2 worthy opponents, right? Lee Zeldin is certainly a former congressman, and you have Rob Astorino running. So you're running. So and the fact that the Republican Party in New York is not really as vibrant as it was in the days when your father was the mayor of New York, right? It's not the same Republican Party. So it's a challenge. And then you have to worry about running against a Democratic opponent should you win that. So what's your strategy for that? Because you have, like I said, some worthy opponents that are also well-financed.
Yeah, I think for us, the most important thing is we're trying to meet as many people as possible. So we've looked and said, where are we going to go to massive gathering places in this great state and meet as many New Yorkers as possible? And I think to your point in terms of the Republican Party maybe not being as vibrant as it was in the 90s when you had a Mayor Giuliani and a Governor Pataki at the time, that's where we've tried to fill in those gaps and fill in those holes and say, where has the NY GOP maybe missed a couple of steps over the past 2 decades since we won a statewide election, which was 2002 in the last Pataki election. So for us, it's going out there and meeting as many New Yorkers as possible. And that's allowed us to kind of have this 17-point lead on Lee and this 23-point lead on Rob, which we've kind of seen consistently throughout the time. But then in terms of winning the general election, obviously you don't want to win the battle and lose the war. You have to win the war as well. So you're right. You're on 2 tracks here. I think for us, it's 3 issues that New Yorkers, to me, this is not just Republicans, but I know many independents and even some Democrats that have come up to me and said, to me, it's about 3 things. It's about getting crime under control and getting our quality of life back here, not just in New York City, but all over New York State. Unfortunately, Rochester just reached the recent high of having the most murders in the recorded history of Rochester. That's true all around this great state right here. We got to get crime under control. Secondly, from an economic perspective, we have to stop competing with the likes of California to be the highest tax state in the country and the most regulated state in the country. We have to take a page more out of the likes of Florida, South Carolina, Texas book and reduce taxes and cut regulation. And third, from an education perspective, parents need more choices in their children's education here in New York. It can't be Albany bureaucrats that are the primary stakeholders in their kids' education. It has to be parents.
But here's the interesting thing. New York has changed in the last 20 years, too. Let's be honest. Andy Cuomo, when he was governor, he was a moderate, and then he saw the wind. He put his finger to the wind, and he saw it in a progressive left-wing direction, and he went in that direction. So being a Republican in New York today, especially after Donald Trump. We'll get that in just a moment. So it's much tougher for a Republican to win. Yes, they had some victories in the last election. You have now 5 city council members that are Republican. One of the biggest numbers that you've had in a long time. But overall, you mentioned Republican to somebody who's a Democrat, which is the overwhelming odds of people in New York are Democrats. They look at you like you came from Mars, right?
Well, look, you make a good point. And when you say 5 city council members, you're right. And we're not running for mayor of New York. If we were running for mayor of New York, it'd be a very different type of race. I mean, in New York City, it's, I think, 7-1 Democrats or Republican. In the state, it's 2.2-1 Democrats or Republicans. So it's a lot more manageable than in New York City. But still, the way the numbers break down, you've got to win 30 to 33% of New York City as a Republican in order to carry the rest of the state. What we've seen with our gubernatorial candidates recently, whether it be in 2018 with Mark Molinaro or 2014 with Rob, is they just get blown out in the city completely, don't even get 25% of the vote. And so in the 50 of the 62 counties in New York where a Republican does win, they can't make up the massive population growth in New York City, which 8.5 of the 19.5 million New Yorkers live in New York City. The good news is what we saw in the most recent mayoral election. Curtis Sliwa ended up winning 29% of the vote in the city. That's 1 point short of our low number that we need to get in order to make sure that we can carry the state. That on top of the big gains in Suffolk, in Nassau County, outside of Albany. We saw this in Erie County as well. Really everywhere in the state performed exactly the way or better than we wanted it in 2021, which is just showing me from a numerical standpoint that the path is there. It's not going to be easy, but again, you have so many independents and even Democrats that are looking and saying, you know what, I don't want critical race theory, or I don't want, multi-gender theory. I shouldn't say multi-gender. I should say 37 gender theory. I guess that's what it's called. Gender dysphoria theory being taught to my 7-year-old and introducing hormone blockers. They've seen that this is just not a matter of liberal versus conservative. This is a matter of common sense versus crazy in many ways.
Now, I know you were a critic of Bill de Blasio, the mayor, former mayor of New York. My question to you is, did you, for a moment, think instead of running for governor, let me run for mayor, follow my father's footsteps? I know you're running for governor. Was that part of your thinking? Did you flirt with that for a while?
I did look at it. And, what I said was after November 3rd, so as you mentioned before, I worked for President Trump in the White House for 4 years. And I spoke to him about this, actually. We spoke about this on, I think, November 8th or 9th. It was right after the election. And he basically said, he was like, look, he said, New York City, don't run in New York City right now. The numbers are not there. And I think, unfortunately, right now in New York City, with it being 7-1 Democrat to Republican, there was not a path to victory. And I promised myself, I promised my family, the first race that I ran, that I would see a path to victory, that we could figure out a path to victory. Well, we certainly can see a path to victory in this gubernatorial race. And that's really why I did not run for the mayoral race. I wanted to make sure, and looking at the gubernatorial race and saying, you know what, if we're going to take a shot at this, let's take a shot to win.
Now, you mentioned Donald Trump. You worked in his White House. You play golf with him. You have a relationship with him. Would you think he will come out and endorse you in the Republican primary?
So what he said to me is pretty simple, right? He's got a couple friends in this primary, and this is what we used to advise him when I worked with him in the White House. He's sitting this one out, but he's been great. I've been speaking with him, if not every week, every other week, sometimes twice a week, depending on what's going on. So he's been great in terms of giving advice and doing that. But he's got multiple friends in this primary, and because of that, he's going to be sitting the primary out. And I understand that. Certainly, the advice that I would have given him as an aide to him when I worked in the White House, when we were looking at all of the political primaries in 2020, because obviously there are many times when he had multiple friends that were in races.
Now, being associated with Donald Trump, it could be a good thing for some of his supporters, but it can also, there are even the Republican Party people who don't want him to run again, that are disassociated themselves from him. So is that, in your opinion, a liability or an asset running both in the Republican and if you win in the Democratic race? Race. Yeah.
I believe it's an asset, and I think you just need to look at the success of the policies. So for me, it's very simple, right? I didn't agree with absolutely everything my former boss did or said all the time. I agreed with the overwhelming majority of it. And I'm not going to run away from that. I worked for him for 4 years. I've known him for 20 years. The last thing I would want to do is sit in front of New Yorkers and be a typical disingenuous politician and completely run away from that. I'm very proud of the low economic, I should say, the high economic numbers and the low unemployment rate that the president had. I mean, if you look at the beginning of 2020, we had the lowest unemployment rate since before man walked on the moon, and the lowest unemployment rate in the history of African American, Asian American, Hispanic Americans ever in recorded history. And that is because of his successful regulatory policies. It's because of tax cuts. It's because of a bunch of different reasons. But his leadership on so many issues, I think, is really, really needed. And it's not just needed at a federal level, as we're seeing right now with the current president, who doesn't seem to know when it's night or when it's day or what's up or down, but it's needed on a state level. It's needed on a local level as well. And so those policies, those successful policies, those are some of the policies that I want to inject into New York State. The ones that I saw from a successful standpoint working in the Trump White House, but also the ones that I saw as certainly a much younger man that I saw coming out of a Giuliani City Hall.
Do you think he's going to run for president again? Has he given you an indication?
If I had to bet, I would bet yes, but he hasn't told me. He's very, very good at keeping you on the edge of your seat, no matter how close you are to him. I saw him, I guess it was about a little less than 2 weeks ago at Mar-a-Lago, and somebody else asked him the question, and he just kind of had a little bit of a wry smile and said, "You'll see, you'll like it, you'll see." So that's where he is now. I think he won't make any official announcements until after our race, until 2023. But you never know.
I saw an interview with President Joe Biden where he said if Donald Trump's running, he's going to run again.
Well, I would, look, I think obviously, and it's obviously easy to sit here and handicap, well, this and that and all that. But the truth is, I mean, when you look at the really the disastrous policies of the Biden administration over the past 11 months, I think there are a lot of Americans that have buyer's remorse in terms of what they missed, the competency of the Trump administration. Of course, much of the leftists in the media tried to paint it the exact opposite. But really, and in working in there, I can tell you, and seeing it on a bunch of different levels, I think it was probably one of the strongest White Houses, certainly in the last 100 years.
But, even though you did a lot,
I read about.
But they did a lot of successful things in regarding Israel. And
absolutely, the Abraham Accords was unbelievable and truly unthinkable. When he used to say he was going to bring peace to the Middle East in 2016, people laughed him off. I think even allies laughed him off. And when you look at the 5 agreements that were made between Israel and other Middle East countries right there, and the truth is, in talking to Ambassador Friedman, former Ambassador Friedman, he had said, we don't need 4 more years. We just need 1 more year to crack this thing open. So I'm really, really hopeful that that in 2024, if it's not President Trump, certainly somebody with the same ideals toward Israel gets back in the White House and resumes what was, I think, probably maybe the most successful presidency in the history of not just our country, but also in Israel relations.
What do you make of the fact that in an interview recently, the president spoke about blank Bibi Netanyahu, that he was angry with him? I thought they had a good relationship. You probably saw that. So what happened?
I think Bibi was probably the first one that came out, if I remember, and congratulated Biden. And the president's very competitive, and I don't think he liked that too much. So my father has had a very good relationship with Bibi, and certainly I know Jared had a great relationship, and I've had the opportunity to sit with him a few times, and I've been nothing but impressed. So my guess on this stuff is time heals all wounds. So
our guest is Andrew, I should say Harold Giuliani.
I like that. That was my grandfather. That was my grandfather's name. So I was very close to being named Harold. My grandmother wanted me to be named Harold. One of the things, and I think this is if whether you have an Italian grandmother or a Jewish grandmother, right? The Italians and the Jews, we do 3 things almost exactly the same: food, family, and guilt. And I have to tell you, my Italian grandmother knew how to do the guilt very well. So
Andrew Giuliani is our guest. He's running for governor of New York on the Republican Party, and he also is on the board of the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and the son of Rudy Giuliani. So growing up, Giuliani, let's look at that. So politics was in the blood. What was it like? Because your father was not afraid to speak his mind. You're not afraid to speak your mind. What was it like? Because they either loved your father, they hated your father, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, when you grow up and you learn from a political standpoint from Rudy Giuliani, and then you end up working 4 years in the White House under Donald Trump. If you're afraid to speak your mind after that point, then I think you've realized you've gotten in the wrong profession. Because whether you love them, whether you don't like them, between my father, between the president, the one thing that I think that any American should be able to admit by now is they're honest with a fault to the American people. And I think it's one of the best things, because honestly, for the American public, we need to make sure that we have more clarity in terms of what's going on in our public policy. So much of it gets done behind the cloak of darkness. And unfortunately, you have what ends up amounting to unelected bureaucrats, whether this be in Washington, D.C., by the way, Zev, or in Albany, who end up creating so much of the public policy. That was, I think, one of the major successes of the president's regulatory reform policy. If you look at it, right, he came in and he said, for every regulation I sign into law, I'm going to cut 2. That number by the time he left office was over 8-1. And that's kind of the same idea that needs to be coming out of Albany right now. We don't need to continue to see Albany grow. We need to see Albany shrink. We need to see maybe local government get a little bit stronger, but more importantly, the private sector gets stronger in our public policy here in New York State.
So would you say that is always in your blood? Did you know from being a young child, I want to run for public office? Was that part of growing up at Giuliani?
I knew it was something that always obviously was top of mind, always dinner table conversation, something that always interests me. I can't tell you honestly, I knew at 5 years old or 10 years old I wanted to run. I mean, I ran for class president in 7th and 8th grade and in high school and all that. And so, it was something that I certainly participated in. And obviously the civic discourse, I think, is so important, to our democracy, to our republic, that was instilled at a very, very young age, not just from my father, but also from my mother as well. So certainly an involvement in politics and in public policy, even more than politics, was certainly instilled.
No, certainly that's the case. Now, first, how's your father doing? He's under a federal investigation and federal indictment. What's happening with that? And will that affect you as well?
Well, he's doing well. I have to tell you, in talking to him every day, one of the things that's amazing to me, as his son, is seeing his resilience. He is, the strongest man that I know, and I'm so proud as a son to see him standing up for what's right, even if it's not easy. When you look at his law license being revoked, I think it was absolutely disgraceful, the fact that he didn't get a hearing, and the people who ruled on it, you had 5 Democratic judges and 0 Republican judges that ruled on suspending his law license. They want to basically take away his income and take away a way for him to earn a living, just because he went out there and spoke about major issues, not just in the 2020 election. I think this goes back way beyond this. I think this goes back to exposing a lot of what was going on with Russiagate. So, anybody who looks at this and just says, well, this is because of his comments on the 2020 election, weren't paying attention the last couple of years and exactly who he was going after and who was vulnerable. So I'm extremely proud of him. And I think this is just Rudy Giuliani being Rudy Giuliani. I mean, he sees corruption, whether it was as a U.S. attorney going after the 5 families here in New York City, in New York State, or whether it was in New York City as mayor and bringing the crime rate down from 2,200 murders a year to below 500 by the time he left office, to this. Whenever he sees corruption, it's not in his bones to be able to look the other way. It's in his DNA to say, we need to do something about this. And he does it.
I'm sure he's going to stump you on the campaign trail, right?
He's been great. He's already come out and done a bunch of stuff for us. we've got some good stuff coming up early in 2022 where he's going to be certainly moving around. He jokes around with me. Obviously everybody remembers his first inauguration when I came up and interjected a few different times. We'll say it kindly. I interjected a few different times, which is now. What's that?
How old were you at that time?
7 years old.
Right.
7 years old. So the joke is that he's working so hard for my campaign because he wants to repay the favor over here. He wants to interrupt my inauguration speech. So I told him, I said, look, when we do the inauguration party, you'll be right at the dais there. Obviously, you can stay over the first night in the governor's mansion. But unfortunately for the speech, I'm going to have to give you the worst seats in the house because I can't trust that you're not going to come on up to the podium and interrupt me.
Now, how has COVID affected your campaigning?
Well, what I would say the last week or two, right, we've seen a couple of different events get pulled down and a little bit more caution with this Omicron variant, which I actually recently spoke to one of the president's former doctors here. And he basically said, look, this is much more contagious than any variant. But he said the good thing is that we keep seeing is this is much more mild, which is a very good thing. And looking at the numbers from South Africa, I think this is going to peak here pretty soon in New York, and then it's going to kind of go back down, almost like, the face of a cliff. If before we ended up seeing where it was like Mount Kilimanjaro, where you're kind of going up this way, this is like the steep face of a cliff, and I think we're going to see it go down in January. I'm not an epidemiologist, so maybe, get the right advice on that one. But in terms of what I keep hearing from the experts, I think you're going to get a lot of people that catch it, but I think you're going to get a lot of mild cases too. So we're obviously being cognizant and aware of this while this spikes up. But for us, look, I think it's really important to get out there and to meet and talk to as many New Yorkers as possible, not just from a campaigning standpoint. Of course, that's important. But, New Yorkers need to be able to come see the candidate, talk to the candidate, look in their eyes, face to face, hear them, feel the passion. But also just as human beings, we need that as well. And considering in March, we'll be starting the third year of our pandemic, and we have so many different treatment options. We have a vaccine. We have all different types of ways that you can approach this. I think it's time that we stop these draconian lockdowns, to be perfectly honest, and these mandates.
That's a whole other issue. Should government be? Well, let me ask you this question: should government be mandating for people to take vaccines? We do it in the case of measles and polio, right? So why is COVID different?
I would say simply because this is short term right now, right? We don't have long term data on this. And so for me, I would not want to see, I don't like the fact of these government mandates right now. I think it's, especially when you start looking at younger New Yorkers, I think that people should have the choice with their family and their doctor of whether or not they are going to take this vaccine or not. Now, I think for most New Yorkers, it's probably the right choice. I think that I think you have to have an honest conversation, whatever your political leanings are on this. And I was proud of President Trump coming out last week and saying it, even though some of his supporters, were not so happy about it. But I think, to be honest, what we need to do is this should not be forced upon people. This is something where we need to get back to reason and try to go through the logical argument on this and hear that, hey, look, the truth is too on this, Zev. The vaccine is not the right answer for absolutely everybody, for 100% of the population. It might be for 80% or 90% or more than 90%, but it's not for 100. We need to make sure
not one size fits all.
It's not one size fits all here. It really isn't. And if you look at some of the issues that we've seen with some of the younger boys, especially with some of the myocarditis, you can actually look at some of the numbers and say, well, potentially the solution is worse than the actual virus itself.
And that's the debate. We're speaking with Andrew Giuliani. You can watch him on Newsmax when you don't catch him with us. He's running for governor of New York. So you mentioned that you like to look people in the eye and the face, and that's important even in this COVID age. So let's look at your relationship with the Jewish community. What is it like?
So for me, obviously, I've been Catholic my entire life. I'm Roman Catholic, but in growing up in New York, I had many Jewish friends in growing up, and obviously
you went to many bar mitzvahs growing up.
What's that? I went to
Oh,
many
oh,
bar
many bar
mitzvahs,
mitzvahs, right?
been to many Shabbats. Look forward to many more Shabbats in the future here. So obviously celebrated Hanukkah and Passover with good family friends. So this is something that my parents kind of taught me at a very, very young age, which is that our Jewish brothers are that they are our brothers as Roman Catholics, as Christians. So for me, it's always been a very, very close, very, very important part. My mother's best friend is Jewish. My father has a couple of very, very close old friends that are Jewish. And for me, in having the opportunity in leaving the White House to serve on the President's Council for the U.S. Holocaust Museum was a great honor, and it certainly was one of those things that I couldn't turn down, and I certainly hope I'm making the country proud.
Now, you're speaking to the largest Jewish audience in the New York area. So I'm curious to know, have you gone to different Jewish events? Have you met with Jewish leaders? Have you gone to Jewish neighborhoods? What has been your Jewish outreach so far? I know it's early.
Yeah.
But if you haven't done, I'd like to know what your plans are.
We are ramping up for much more here in the later winter months of 2022 and in the spring of 2022. So for us, I want to make sure that we're doing as much as possible for the community and coming to as many events as possible, greeting as many people as possible. We're actually putting together a plan now that we'll have out kind of by the middle of January to make sure that we're getting up there and we're ramping up and we're talking to as many Jewish New Yorkers as possible. But for me, I think one of the things, and I think this has been really important in our race here, is making sure that we don't see any potential discrimination like we may have seen from the last governor, from Cuomo, and certainly from this current mayor, soon to be former mayor. That'll be very sweet when we could say former mayor de Blasio. But in terms of, I think, going after some of the Jewish businesses in 2020, going after places of worship, that stuff needs to be independent of the state. So for me, I think it's very, very simple. We need to make sure that people have, just like we believe in our First Amendment rights, so you have the free opportunity to practice religion here in our great state. I would certainly do everything I can to preserve that, and you will have a Governor Giuliani who will make sure that not just the Jewish community, but the Christian community, the Muslim community will have the opportunity to practice their religion safely here in New York without being discriminated on by the state.
This may be the toughest question of the interview so far, Andrew. Andrew Harrell. No, we say that affectionately. So the question I asked everybody running for office, and you may not have the exposure yet, but you've gone to some Jewish events, I'm sure, over the course of time, including Shabbat dinner. What is your favorite Jewish food? That's the toughest question of the interview.
No, I mean, I love matzo ball soup, to be honest. It's just great. I know that this is not served at Shabbat, but I got to tell you, I was at Katz's Deli a couple weeks ago and I had a knish. And just like whenever you get the knish with the spicy brown mustard from Katz's, it's just tough to beat that right there. So, that's one of them right there. I always, when I was younger, and I don't have a taste for it now for some reason, but I always loved the gefilte fish when I was younger. Now, for some reason, I don't know why, it lost me a little bit. But I would say probably the knish is probably, it's tough to beat a really, really good knish when you get the spicy brown mustard on it right there. So also, I'm just kind of a potatoes kind of guy,
Well, I'm a potatoes kind of guy too. You love latkes, the potato pancakes. That's especially Hanukkah, but all year round.
Absolutely.
So if you go to a Jewish event and you look at gefilte fish in the face, will you eat it?
I will have a couple of bites. I don't know if I finish it, to be perfectly honest. I want to be as honest as possible. I will have a couple bites, but I got to see how that first bite will treat me right there. The latkes, no problem. I'm going to the latkes. I'll definitely have the latkes. The knish, I'll definitely have the knish. So you can count on that one.
What do you think is going to be your biggest challenge running for governor of New York?
Good question. I think for us, it's a matter of making sure that we can convince as many Democrats as possible. One of the things that we've seen in poll after poll, aside from kind of the leads that we have said that, double-digit leads that we've consistently seen in the Republican nomination, we've also seen that about 23 to 29% of Democrats find our candidacy favorable. Those are the kind of numbers that we need to see cross over in terms of winning this thing. But in a state that is 2-1 Democrat to Republican, a little more than 2-1 Democrat to Republican, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we possibly can, not just to make sure we're rallying as many Republicans as possible, but also independents and Democrats. One of the issues that I think many independents and Democrats certainly find favorable in our candidacy is education. We talk about more choice to parents. One of the things that we talk about
to alleviate the plight of yeshiva parents, parochial school parents that are doubly taxed. They're paying taxes,
exactly.
$30,000 worth of tuition. What can we do to help them?
So I'm glad you asked that, because it's exactly what I was getting into there. Aside from the charter school option right there, what I also want to do is I want to make sure that we have tax credits that are following parents and their students right there. So that way the tax dollars would follow a yeshiva school parent or a parochial school parent, and that way they're not being doubly taxed right there. And you know what that does, which is beautiful? That creates competition in the public school system as well. So it's not just a matter of relieving the parents who are being doubly taxed. And by the way, it will now give parents that are not as well off the option to be able to send their kids to a yeshiva school or to a parochial school or to a private school where they may be performing better than their local public school. But it also will allow more parents the option to be able to do that. That's going to just create competition throughout the entire system. And that's going to help not just the yeshiva schools and the parochial schools. It's going to help the public schools as well, because if they see that, hey, look, we're not getting the same kind of funding because we're losing parents, guess what? They have two options. They can continue down that path, in which case funding and students continue to decrease, or they look and say, we need to put a better product out there.
In the moment or two that we have left, there's been a controversy where should the state be regulating the content of secular education in yeshivas and other religious schools. Your position on that?
No, absolutely not. I think this is something, especially when we get into private and parochial schools, parents have made a decision to send their children there, and it's the parents and that specific school administrators that should do that. But I'm a big believer that the parents need to be the primary stakeholder in their children's education. I think it was actually probably one of the most honest things I've heard a Democrat say recently when McAuliffe said, no, the parents shouldn't be the primary stakeholders in education. The state needs to be running the show here. He was extremely wrong, but it was very honest, because it's exactly the mindset, I think, of many Democrats when it comes to this.
That's why in Virginia, he didn't win the election.
Exactly. But for us, absolutely, parents need to be the ones that are the primary stakeholders that are dictating curriculum.
Andrew Giuliani, thank you for joining us. We look forward to having you back again. Then we're going to get a gefilte fish report, another report. So it's on the radar screen. Don't worry.
I'm glad you mentioned latkes, because it slipped my mind when you asked. But I'm going to go for the latkes first, I think. That sounds a little better.
I got a commitment from Eric Adams that when he's be married, he's going to have a glatt kosher kitchen at Gracie Mansion.
Okay.
Same thing in Albany.
You got a commitment here too. Absolutely.
And we're going to have gefilte fish or no on the menu?
We'll put it on the menu. We'll put it on the menu there. I don't know why I liked it as a kid. I did, but the last time I tried it, it was I wouldn't say I disliked it, but it wasn't one of my favorites. So like I said, I'll try that first bite and see, but we'll go from there. Definitely, you can commit on the latkes, the knishes, no problem there. Matzo ball soup, I'm in on all three.
Well, we got it. Anyway, thank you for joining us. Look forward to having you. Regards to your father.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I will definitely send him your regards, Evan.
And we're going to be right back.